No one wanted him, not with that limp, those scars, or those hollow eyes. Until one woman raised her hand. On the edge of a rain-soaked Montana town, the old livestock auction house looked like a relic of some harsher time. Every Thursday, farmers and ranchers from miles around gathered in the battered, echoing barn to haggle over cattle, sheep, even working dogs. The air inside always smelled of hay, sweat, and the metallic edge of disappointment. Nora Quinn stood at the back, almost a shadow against the warped wood. At 37, she moved with a quiet confidence, her hair tucked into a faded ball cap, her boots muddy from the drive-in. She'd spent years tracking wolves and bears for conservation work. But since the accident, since she'd lost everything that mattered, she lived alone up in a mountain cabin, letting silence do most of her healing. But that day, something had pulled her to town. Maybe it was the nagging dream she'd had the night before, flashes of wild eyes and tangled fur, a cry she couldn't answer. Or maybe it was just the restless guilt that never really let her go. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man with a voice like a rusty saw, banged his gavel. Lot 39, working dog, male, German Shepherd, estimated age 8, previous owner deceased. That was generous. The animal that limped out onto the sawdust ring looked more ghost than dog. He had a mottled coat, matted in places and showing a web of scars. His right back leg dragged slightly, giving him a lopsided gait. Worst were his eyes, flat, empty, staring through people, not at them. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. One rancher shook his head. Dog like that, he'll spook the stock or get himself killed, he muttered to his neighbor. Start and bid, $50, the auctioneer called, looking bored. Silence. He dropped to 30, 20, 10. Someone in the back snickered. Might as well pay someone to take him. The dog, if he had a name, nobody mentioned it, stood stock still, flinching as the gavel slammed again. Nora's heart tightened. There was something in the way he watched the door, as if he was counting in the ways out. All right then, $5, the auctioneer said, almost laughing. Nora didn't raise her hand so much as lifted a few inches off her coat pocket. She was almost surprised to feel her own fingers moving. The auctioneer noticed. We have 5? Anyone for 10? Nothing. He shrugged. Sold, to the lady in the back. There was a soft, half-mocking applause as Nora stepped forward to the ring. The auctioneer handed her a slip. You'll want to keep him on a short leash. Dogs like that don't forget bad times easy. She nodded, barely listening, her focus on the German Shepherd now cowering in the corner of the pen. Up close, she could see more. He had an old burn scar under one ear, and the fur on his left shoulder was thin, as if it had been shaved for stitches long ago. Nora crouched, hands loose, eyes level. Hey there, not gonna hurt you? The dog shivered, refused to meet her gaze. For a moment, he pressed himself back, as if bracing for a blow that never came. The barn was nearly empty when she finally coaxed him up, using a gentle voice and a piece of jerky she'd stashed in her pocket. It took patience, and more than a little stubbornness, but eventually he let her slip a leash over his head. Outside, the rain had let up, leaving everything slick and gray. Nora loaded the German Shepherd into the passenger seat of her battered pickup. He shrank against the door, staring straight ahead, every muscle tight. She didn't speak, didn't try to pet him, just started the engine and let the radio play something soft and wordless. The drive up into the mountains was slow, the road winding through pine forests and low fog. The dog, she decided to call him Rook, after the chess piece that always stood guard. Didn't move, didn't whine, didn't even look at her. It was almost dark when they reached her cabin, a squat, weather-beaten place with a porch sagging under years of snow and wind. Nora parked, let Rook out, and waited. He stood stiff in the mud, gaze flicking everywhere but never settling. The trees creaked, a crow cawed from somewhere overhead. She left the door open. If you want to come in, you can, or you can wait out here. Up to you. Rook hesitated, then crept inside, belly low, every step a question mark. Nora didn't try to touch him. She set a bowl of water and a plate of plain chicken by the fireplace, lit a lamp, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, making a show of ignoring him. From the corner of her eye, she watched as Rook sniffed at the water, then backed away. He didn't eat. He curled into a tight ball near the door, eyes half closed but never fully at rest. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the occasional shift of wind outside. Nora felt the heavy ache of old memories, loss, regret, loneliness. But she also felt something else, a quiet spark of purpose. Somewhere in that broken dog, she saw a mirror of herself. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other learn how to start again. The road twisted up into the mountains, each bend bringing them farther from town and closer to isolation. Nora barely glanced at Rook as she drove. She knew, from years spent watching wounded animals, that sometimes the only kindness was to be quiet, to let them decide what to do with the silence. The old pickup rattled over potholes and slid a little on the muddy gravel. Nora kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on her thigh, resisting the urge to reach out. Rook pressed against the door, his eyes glued to the window, but not seeing anything, every muscle so tense she could almost hear it. A mile from her cabin, Nora slowed at a fallen branch. The truck idled, headlights brushing against the dark, damp bark. A deer bolted across the road, vanishing into the underbrush. Rook flinched hard, claws scraping the vinyl seat, and Nora heard the faintest whine, so soft it might have been the wind. "Easy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as much for herself as for him. When they finally pulled up beside the cabin, Nora killed the engine. Rain dripped from the trees, a soft, steady tapping. For a moment neither of them moved. She glanced at Rook. His tail was curled tight, head tucked low. Nora reached for the door, then paused, waiting. He didn't move. "All right," she said quietly, stepping out into the evening air. She circled the truck, boots squelching in the soft mud, and opened the passenger door. Rook hesitated, eyes darting, ears pressed back. Nora stepped aside, letting the leash go slack. The space between them filled with unspoken questions. After what felt like forever, Rook jumped down, landing awkwardly on his bad leg. He stumbled, caught himself, then limped toward the porch. Nora followed at a respectful distance, her own heartbeat oddly loud in her ears. Inside, the cabin was dim and warm. A fire smoldered in the old stone hearth, casting flickering shadows. Rook crept along the walls, circling, never turning his back to her. He stopped only when he found the kitchen corner, lowering himself slowly to the floor, still watching. Nora set a bowl of water nearby. She put out the plate of chicken again, but didn't push it closer. She just sat at the table, thumbing through her battered notebook, pretending to be absorbed in some old grocery list. Occasionally, she glanced up, never directly at him, always just past. Time passed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. The fire crackled. Rook didn't touch the food or water. Every small sound, a log shifting, a distant coyote's call, made him tense. Nora leaned back, studying him. The scars on his leg looked raw in the firelight. His ears twitched with each gust of wind. She wondered what kind of life had taught him to expect hurt at every sound. After a while, Nora rose, moved slowly, and fetched a soft, old blanket from the cedar chest in her bedroom. She laid it out a few feet from him, making a kind of offer, an island in the middle of strange territory. Rook eyed the blanket, but made no move. She decided not to speak. Instead, she went about her evening routine, feeding the wood stove, checking the locks, scribbling notes in the margins of a faded field guide. She pretended, for his sake, that this was all perfectly normal. That she always had a battered German shepherd curled by the door, refusing to eat. But inside, Nora's mind was restless. She replayed the auction again and again, the laughter, the dismissal, the battered dog with his hollow eyes. There was something in Rook's silence that demanded patience, a quiet defiance, a refusal to trust so easily. Late that night, Nora got ready for bed. She paused at the bedroom door. "You can stay out here if you want," she said softly, voice steady. "No one's going to bother you. Not tonight." She left the door open a crack. As she lay in bed, she listened, half hoping, half dreading, to hear the sound of paws on the floor. But the cabin stayed quiet. Rook kept to his corner. Sometime past midnight, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain lashed the roof, drumming harder and harder. In the darkness, Nora sat up, every sense alert. She heard a shuffle, then claws tapping softly on the wooden floor. She waited, barely breathing. There, just inside her doorway, Rook stood, head low, body trembling. Nora stayed still. After a long, agonizing minute, he stepped closer to her bed, then curled on the blanket she'd left. Not at her feet, not beside her, but close enough to share the warmth. Neither of them slept much. But when morning came, and pale sunlight trickled through the window, Rook was still there. Nora understood, in her bones, how hard it was to stay. She got up quietly, filled his bowl again, and this time she saw him sniff the food, hesitating only a moment before taking a careful, tentative bite. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she watched him, Nora felt something inside her shift, like the first cracks in winter ice, quiet and dangerous and full of hope. Rook's journey home had begun, but neither of them could have guessed just how far that road would stretch or how many shadows it would cross before the light returned. Sunlight broke through the pines, painting lines of gold on the cabin floor. For a brief moment, everything seemed calm. Nora watched Rook from the kitchen, careful not to make any sudden movements. He lay curled in the spot near her bedroom door, ears flicking with every distant noise, eyes half closed but never truly resting. Breakfast for Nora was silent, just oatmeal and black coffee, the way she liked it. She set another plate of plain chicken near Rook. He hesitated, sniffed, then ate a few small bites. She saw him freeze at the sound of a spoon clinking against her mug. Every little noise sent a shiver through him. Nora made a mental note. Avoid sudden sounds. After clearing up, she opened the door to let in the fresh mountain air. Rook stared at the doorway, torn between the instinct to bolt and the uncertainty of what waited outside. He didn't move. Nora left it open, giving him the choice. She spent the next hour tending her small vegetable patch and checking the fencing along her property. The old wooden fence had kept out wolves and bears for years. Today, she found herself glancing back at the house more often than usual. Inside, Rook wandered the cabin, nose to the ground. He avoided the fireplace and never once let his back face an open door. When a distant chainsaw started up from a neighbor's property, Rook jerked to his feet, every muscle quivering, and darted to the darkest corner of the room, pressing himself into the wall. Nora knelt, slow and deliberate, just close enough to speak softly. "It's okay, Rook. That's just noise. Nothing more." Rook didn't look at her, but his panting slowed. Nora saw a strange pattern beneath his fur. A cluster of circular scars, pink and hairless, running along his ribs and right hind leg. She frowned, recognizing the marks from wildlife rescue cases she'd seen before. They weren't from fights or accidents. They were old wounds, the kind left by man-made things. She made another note in her battered notebook. Circular scars, multiple sites, hesitates at doors, flinches at loud mechanical sounds. As the day wore on, she decided to see if Rook would go outside. She opened the door wider, stepped onto the porch, and whistled softly. Rook hovered at the threshold, paws on the line between inside and out. He trembled, breathing fast. A fly buzzed near his ear. Suddenly, he bolted through the doorway, nearly knocking into Nora as he shot past her, sprinting for the woods. Nora's heart leaped. She jogged after him, calling gently, but Rook was gone, vanished into the underbrush. Fear twisted in her gut. The forest was wild, full of coyotes and rough terrain. For hours she searched, calling and waiting, listening for any sign. As dusk fell, she spotted movement near the tree line. Rook emerged, limping badly, covered in mud, tongue lolling. He kept his distance, circling wide before approaching the cabin, never letting Nora between him and the open space. She let him come to her. standing quiet, hands by her sides. That night, as the wind rattled the window, Nora studied Rook's scars with a flashlight. She caught a glimpse of an old tattoo inside his left ear. Faded numbers. Barely legible, she jotted them down. Possibly ID number? Shelter or testing? Rook flinched as she examined him, body tensing as if expecting pain. She retreated, murmuring, "That's enough for now." Rook backed into his usual spot, watching her with wary eyes. Later, Nora sat by the fire, flipping through her old wildlife medical guides, comparing the scars. Some looked like burns, maybe from heated metal. Others were deeper, almost like punctures from needles or probes. It sickened her, thinking of what this dog must have endured. A sudden memory surfaced. Her early days as a tracker, working near ranches rumored to sell off unwanted animals for research. She'd heard stories of illegal testing, dogs and livestock disappearing overnight, but she'd never found proof. Now, here was the proof, lying in her living room, trying to relearn trust. As if sensing her gaze, Rook lifted his head. His eyes met hers for the first time. They were cloudy with pain, but clear enough to show a flicker of something else, curiosity or maybe hope. Nora whispered, "You and me, we've both got scars, don't we?" She smiled just a little. Rook didn't move, but he didn't look away. The night stretched on. A sudden gust blew through the pines, making the house creak. Nora made one last note in her book. Suspect deeper trauma. Triggers. Buzzing, sudden movements, confined spaces. Need to learn more. Before turning in, Nora laid out another blanket, this time closer to the fire. She nodded to Rook, then left the room. Behind her, she heard the soft pad of paws and the sound of him settling down. Nora fell asleep with the notebook in her hand and a growing determination in her heart. Whatever had been done to this dog, she would find the truth. And maybe, just maybe, help Rook and herself heal. The next morning, fog clung to the mountain slopes and the world felt muffled, insulated from the outside. Nora wrapped herself in a thick sweater and poured coffee, her gaze drifting to where Rook lay dozing by the fire. He seemed a little more settled, his breaths deep and steady, but his dreams were restless, his legs twitching, his ears flicking back and forth at every distant sound. Nora sat at her kitchen table, turning over the information she'd gathered so far. She glanced again at the faded tattoo inside Rook's ear, scribbled on a scrap of paper. There were numbers and letters, almost like a code, probably an identifier from a breeder, shelter, or something else, something more sinister. She picked up her phone and dialed Lena Miles, her old friend and the only vet she trusted. Lena's voice was warm and a little husky, touched by too many late nights at the clinic. "Hey, stranger," Lena said, a yawn audible even through the static. "Morning. I've got a case for you." Nora replied, voice low so as not to disturb Rook. "German Shepherd, maybe 8. Picked him up at the auction yesterday. He's got some unusual scars and a faded tattoo. You ever seen that before?" Lena hummed. "You know I've seen a lot. You want to bring him by today?" "Not yet. He's still skittish, barely trusts me. Could I send you some pictures?" "Sure, send them over. You doing okay out there, Nora?" Nora hesitated. "One day at a time." She snapped a few discreet photos of Rook's scars and the tattoo, and then texted them to Lena along with her notes. Triggers, behaviors, things she couldn't shake from her mind. Lena's reply was almost immediate. "Lena, those look like old experimental burn scars. And that tattoo looks familiar." "I'll check my records." Nora's pulse quickened. She spent the next few hours researching online, searching animal databases, rescue forums, even old news articles about illegal animal testing and auctions in Montana. A handful of cases popped up: livestock disappearing, rumors of underground labs. A name she recognized from old rumors: Everett Rohr. She felt a chill run down her spine. Everett Rohr had been a whisper in the wind during her years as a wildlife tracker, a name people spoke of with caution, but never on record. She remembered, years back, finding strange tracks near an abandoned ranch: tires, boot prints, and once a pile of burned dog collars. She'd suspected something illegal, but there was never enough proof. Now, as she scrolled through archive stories, she found a grainy photo. Roar, in a cowboy hat, shaking hands with auctioneers. His face was always a little out of focus, but his reputation for cruelty wasn't. Dogs, cattle, even wild horses, he'd moved them through testing facilities disguised as rescue sanctuaries. Rook shifted, groaning quietly, bringing Nora back to the present. She knelt beside him, whispering, "We'll get answers. I promise." For a moment, she let her hand rest near his paw. He didn't pull away. That afternoon, Lena called back. "Nora, I think you're onto something. That tattoo matches animals traced to a string of illegal testing rings from a few years ago, mostly livestock, but some dogs, ones with undesirable traits, supposedly used for medical experiments." Nora's stomach twisted. "You think Rook was one of them?" "It's possible. Those scars. He was restrained, probably burned for tests. And the triggers you mentioned, those don't come from nothing." The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past pressing down. Lena spoke again, her voice harder. "If Roar's name is involved, you need to be careful, Nora. That crowd doesn't like loose ends. Promise me you'll keep your head down." "I will," Nora said, though she didn't really believe it. She felt an old fire kindling inside, something she thought she'd lost the day her career as a tracker ended. As dusk fell, Nora decided to look for physical evidence. She and Rook walked the edge of her property, the forest silent but watchful. She carried a flashlight and a camera, snapping photos of any tire tracks or broken fences. Rook followed at her side, sometimes pausing to sniff the ground or stare into the woods. Suddenly, Rook stopped, ears pricked, muscles tense. Nora froze, following his gaze. There was nothing there, just shadows shifting in the twilight, but Rook's growl was low and certain. Nora's heart pounded. She crouched beside him, one hand on his collar, scanning the tree line. "Is someone out there?" No reply, just the hush of wind and the lonely call of a nightbird. But Nora didn't shake the feeling of being watched. Back inside, she locked the doors and double-checked the windows. She uploaded her photos and copied all her notes onto a flash drive, tucking it away in her bedroom. Her mind whirled with questions. Who still cared about these old secrets? Would Rook's presence put them both at risk? She turned off the lights and sat by Rook, who now lay close enough to feel her warmth. "We'll keep digging," she whispered, "but I need you to stick with me." Rook pressed his nose to her hand, just for a moment. It was enough. That night, Nora barely slept, haunted by old names, new threats, and the hope that, together, they could bring darkness into the light. By the end of the week, Nora could feel the unease in her bones, a weight heavier than the mountain fog. It was the way the wind seemed to carry whispers, the way the forest watched with old, secret eyes. Ever since learning Rook's scars might be tied to Everett Roar's illegal operation, Nora's isolation felt more exposed than ever. It started with a phone call from her neighbor, Bill Jensen, who owned the ranch 3 miles down the road. Bill's voice was strained, laced with worry. "Nora, did you hear about the break-in at the Turner place?" She shook her head, pressing the phone tight to her ear. "No. What happened?" Someone busted into their barn, left the animals out, ransacked the feed room. Not the usual kind of vandalism. Sheriff thinks it's connected to those animal thefts last year. There were tire tracks all over the back trail." Nora's hand tightened on the receiver. "Any idea who?" "Not yet. But if you see anything, lock your doors. And keep an eye on that new dog of yours. Folks are saying someone's looking for animals that don't belong." Nora promised she would, but the call left her rattled. She hung up and stared at Rook, who lay stretched across the old rug, finally dozing without flinching at every creak in the floorboards. Or she couldn't shake the sense that whatever had haunted his past wasn't done with him yet. That afternoon, Nora walked the property line with Rook. The air was sharp and cold, pine needles crunching underfoot. Rook padded silently beside her, more relaxed than he'd been, but still hyper-alert. Near the eastern fence, Nora spotted something new. Deep, muddy tire tracks that hadn't been there the day before. They curved off the main drive and disappeared into the woods. Rook stopped, hackles raised. He let out a low, guttural growl, the first real sound he'd made since coming home. Nora froze, her heart thudding against her ribs. She knelt beside him, peering at the tracks, heavy treads, wide enough for a pickup, too fresh to be old logging trucks or ranchers. Someone had been here, close, maybe watching, maybe looking for something. She grabbed her phone, snapping a few photos of the tracks. Rook circled the spot, nose to the ground, then glanced up at her, as if trying to say, "I know this scent." That evening, Nora double-checked every lock on the cabin and drew the curtains tight. The unease grew thicker as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the world in bruised shades of blue and gray. She sat by the fire. Rook pressed close to her leg and made notes in her journal. Tire tracks. Unfamiliar. Rook's first growl. Feels like a warning. Nora debated calling the sheriff, but what would she say? I have a bad feeling, and my dog growled. Still, she couldn't shake the image of Roar's cruel face, the shadows in those old auction house photos. She decided to call Lena, needing to hear a familiar voice. You think it's him, Nora whispered, keeping her voice low so Rook wouldn't sense her fear. I think it could be, Lena replied. Those guys don't just disappear, Nora. Sometimes they lay low and wait until they think nobody's watching. Nora's mind spun with questions. Was Rook just unlucky, or was he a thread to something bigger, something that still made men like Roar nervous, even now? The next morning brought little relief. A truck she didn't recognize rolled slow past the end of her drive, pausing long enough for her to spot a man in a ball cap peering at the mailbox. When Nora stepped out onto the porch, the truck sped off in a spray of gravel. Rook stood beside her, tail rigid, teeth bared in silent warning. Nora's unease turned into steel. She realized she couldn't hide from this, not if it meant putting Rook or herself in danger. She spent the day preparing, old instincts returning. She made copies of all her notes and evidence, storing them in several places, a flash drive in the freezer, a printed folder in the barn, a backup with Lena. She checked her old trail cams, repositioning them to face the main road and the edge of the woods. If anyone came close again, she'd see it. That night, as the wind howled and branches tapped the roof, Rook stood guard by the door, his body blocking the entrance. Nora couldn't remember the last time she'd felt both so alone and so fiercely determined. In the middle of the night, a noise outside jolted her awake. She crept to the window and saw the glint of headlights moving through the trees, then a flash of movement. Rook stood beside her, not barking, but watching, every muscle ready. The truck drove away, but it was a message, clear as day. Nora understood. Whoever wanted Rook, or what he knew, was willing to come into the dark to get it. Nora pressed her hand to Rook's head, feeling the heat of his breath, the steady thump of his heart. You're safe here, she whispered, more a promise to herself than to him. But the truth was, safety now had to be earned. One night, one day at a time, with both eyes open and her past no longer hidden. In the cabin's shadow and silence, Nora realized she was no longer just a bystander in Rook's story. She was a part of it, and she would fight for both of them, whatever it took. After a sleepless night, Nora woke to the thin, gray light of dawn, her mind thick with worry. Rook hadn't moved from his post at the door, still and vigilant, his eyes tracking every shift in the shadows. She made a pot of coffee and sat on the floor beside him, quietly offering him a piece of chicken. He took it gently, eyes never leaving the window. The air outside was sharp, the morning quiet broken only by the chirp of a distant jay and the crackle of frost beneath Nora's boot. Oh, she watched Rook, sensing the restless energy in his muscles. He was pacing now, nose low, pausing every few feet to sniff the air as if searching for a lost memory. Nora tried to distract herself with chores, but Rook was persistent. He circled the cabin, whining at the back door. When she finally let him out, He bounded across the yard, not in fear, but with an urgent purpose, pausing only to make sure she was following. All right, but, boy, Nora muttered, grabbing her coat. Lead the way. The forest loomed at the edge of her property, dense, silent, a world apart from the open fields below. Rook plunged in, moving faster than she'd ever seen him, limping but determined. Nora hurried to keep up, branches snapping against her legs, breath steaming in the cold. They climbed a ridge, crossed a shallow creek, and followed an old game trail that snaked deeper into the woods. Rook stopped often, nose to the ground, his body quivering with focus. Nora's heart pounded. She recognized some of the landmarks, a mossy stump, a lightning-blasted pine. But Rook was pulling her farther than she usually dared go alone. After nearly an hour, Rook stopped dead in a small clearing hemmed by tangled brush. He sniffed furiously at the earth, then began to dig with a single-minded intensity. Nora knelt beside him, brushing away leaves and dirt. The ground was soft and disturbed. Her hand struck something hard and cold, a battered metal crate, half buried beneath roots and soil. She glanced at Rook. He stood back, chest heaving, watching her with an intensity she'd never seen before. Nora pried the crate open, coughing as the smell of old rust and mildew hit her nose. Inside, she found a jumbled collection of objects, faded dog tags, grainy Polaroids, scraps of torn fabric, and a notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. Nora's fingers shook as she sorted through the evidence. The tags bore numbers and names, some matching the code tattooed in Rook's ear. The photos showed dogs, dozens of them, chained or caged, many with the same haunted look Rook had when she first saw him at the auction. The notebook was the worst. She flipped through page after page of careful, slanted handwriting. Each entry listed animal IDs, brief descriptions, and columns labeled test, reaction, and disposition. The language was cold, clinical, no names, only numbers. And many of the animals were marked as deceased, sold, or simply discarded. Nora's stomach twisted as she read the last pages. Entries dated from years ago, but one name scrawled in the margin, unmistakable, Everett Roar. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos of every page and item. Rook stood over her, trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper. She put a hand on his head, feeling the silent strength there. "You remembered this, didn't you?" she whispered. "You brought me here for a reason." A sudden noise, a branch snapping, too deliberate to be the wind, made Nora freeze. She stuffed everything back into the crate and scanned the trees, adrenaline surging. Rook's hackles rose. A low rumble building in his chest. Nora listened, every sense alert. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement, a flash of color between the trunks, far off, then gone. Her mind raced. Was someone watching them? Had Rook's instincts brought them straight into danger? She gathered herself. "Come on, boy," she whispered. Rook stayed close as she hurried back toward the cabin, her mind racing with possibilities. The evidence she'd found wasn't just proof of Rook's suffering. It was enough to reopen old wounds, to bring justice if handled right. But it also put a target on her back. Back home, she locked the crate in her storage chest and uploaded every photo and scan to a secure cloud folder, sharing the link with Lena and saving a copy on an encrypted drive. She labeled everything. Evidence, animal cruelty, Roar case, Bozeman area. Rook circled the cabin restlessly, as if sensing her anxiety. Nora sat down and pulled him close. For the first time, he let her rest her cheek on his head, their breathing sinking in the hush of the afternoon. She made notes, voice trembling as she recorded. Discovered buried crate with direct links to Roar's illegal operation. Dog tags, auction logs, photos. Rook led me there. I believe this is the proof law enforcement needs. As the sun set, Nora looked out over the valley, fear and hope warring inside her. The road ahead was dangerous, but she wasn't running anymore. For Rook, for every scarred animal in those photos, she was ready to fight. Rook pressed against her, no longer just a survivor, but a guide, leading her not away from the darkness, but through it, toward a fragile, uncertain light. The next morning, Nora sat at her battered kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence Rook had unearthed. The crate, its rusted edges gleaming in the early sun, sat open before her. The dog tags clinked softly as she lifted them, each one a small memorial for a life changed or lost. The notebook, with its neat columns and cold words, weighed heavy in her hands. Nora looked at Rook, stretched out in a patch of light by the door. He watched her with patient eyes, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone in this. She knew what she had to do. The risk was real. Everett Roar's world wasn't just old rumors. He had real power, and there were people who'd go to great lengths to keep the past buried. But this was bigger than fear. She packed the evidence in a backpack, slipping her notebook inside her coat pocket. She left Rook's leash on the hook by the door, but Rook followed her anyway, never letting her out of sight. She gave him a reassuring glance. "You stay here, buddy. I'll be back, I promise." The drive down the mountain to Bozeman was tense. Every truck in the rear view felt like a shadow, every glance from passing drivers a question. Nora's hands were steady, but her mind raced. She rehearsed what she would say to the sheriff's office, how she would explain the scars, the crate, the patterns in the notebook. She knew the evidence was strong, but in rural Montana, powerful people could bend the truth. She needed the right ally. At the sheriff's office, the receptionist eyed Nora's muddy boots and the battered backpack with suspicion. "You here to file a report, miss?" Nora nodded. "It's about animal cruelty, and something worse." They ushered her into a small office where a middle-aged deputy named Carter listened as Nora laid out the evidence. The crate, the tags, the notebook, the photos, the scars on Rook. She spoke quietly, but with steel in her voice, her field experience lending credibility. Carter listened, at first skeptical, but as Nora presented the proof, especially the links to Everett Roar, his face hardened with concern. "Everett Roar's name hasn't come up in years," Carter muttered. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Nora replied, meeting his gaze. "And you'll find a matching tattoo in Rook's ear. There are others out there, too. The auction houses, the missing animals, they're all tied together." Carter called in the sheriff, and soon Nora found herself giving a formal statement. They copied the files and logs, took photos of the evidence, and asked her to detail every strange occurrence at her cabin. The break-ins, the tire tracks, and the unknown truck. At one point, Carter paused, lowering his voice. "You know, this could get dangerous. If these people realize you're working with us..." "I'm not backing down," Nora said, jaw set. "Too many have suffered already." After hours of questioning and paperwork, Carter nodded. "We'll open a full investigation and keep an eye on your property. I'd advise you to keep a low profile. If anyone contacts you, let us know immediately. And if you have more evidence, bring it to us. We'll need all of it." Driving home, Nora's relief was shadowed by tension. She checked her phone and saw a text from Lena. Heard from Carter. "You did the right thing. Be careful." When she reached her cabin, the first thing she saw was Rook waiting on the porch. He greeted her, not with a wag, but with a gentle nudge, as if asking, "Are we safe now?" Nora crouched beside him, burying her hands in his thick fur. "You did good, Rook. You did real good." But safety was still uncertain. That evening, Nora kept her lights low and double-checked her trail cameras. She copied her files again, this time sending them to an old friend from her tracker days, someone who worked in investigative journalism, just in case. The sheriff's office moved fast. Within days, they raided 2 old facilities linked to Roar, finding cages, equipment, and records matching what Nora had brought them. A press release mentioned new evidence from a confidential source, and suddenly the town buzzed with rumors. Nora agreed to an anonymous interview with a local reporter, her voice disguised and her face blurred for the broadcast. She spoke of a survivor who remembered the way back, a dog whose scars had finally been seen for what they were. The attention brought its own dangers. One night, a stone crashed through Nora's front window, landing near Rook's bed. She called the sheriff immediately. Patrol cars began cruising the area, but the message was clear. Not everyone wanted the truth out. Still, as Nora watched the sunset from her porch, Rook beside her, she felt the tiniest spark of hope. For the first time in years, she'd chosen to fight, to make her voice and Rook's story heard. "You don't need a voice to save someone," she whispered as Rook leaned into her side, steady and brave. "You just need to stay." And as darkness fell, Nora understood. The past could not hold her, or Rook, any longer. Word travels quickly in a small Montana town, and soon it was everywhere, on the lips of neighbors, whispered in grocery aisles, splashed across local news. The story of the battered German shepherd with haunted eyes, rescued from the margins of cruelty and brought home by a woman who once tracked wolves, had struck a chord far beyond the mountain's shadow. Nora had never imagined her lonely stretch of forest would become a beacon. But within days of the sheriff's raid, her phone buzzed with calls and messages, some from old friends offering support, others from strangers who'd heard about her fight and wanted to help, or needed help themselves. The first to arrive was a young woman named Abby, her hands trembling as she pulled into Nora's driveway in a battered Subaru. She stepped out, cradling a tiny mutt against her chest. The dog's fur was patchy, its eyes rimmed with worry. Abby's own gaze flickered from Rook, now calm and regal on the porch, to Nora, who met her with a gentle nod. I heard you help animals like this," Abby stammered. "The shelters turned me away. They said he's too scared to be adopted." Nora knelt, letting Rook walk out to greet the newcomer. Rook moved slowly, tail swaying low, offering the mutt a sniff before gently touching noses. To Abby's surprise, her little dog seemed to relax for the first time in weeks. "Come inside," Nora said. "There's room for both of you." That day marked a quiet turning point. The next week brought more visitors, a boy named Leo, mute since the fire that had left scars down his arms, who'd heard from his therapist about the tracker lady in the woods. Leo arrived with his grandmother and a skittish black cat who'd lived for months beneath their trailer. Leo didn't speak, but when Rook approached him, the boy's rigid posture softened. By the end of the afternoon, he was sitting in the grass, one hand on Rook's back, his eyes closed in silent trust. The transformation was slow but undeniable. Nora repaired the sagging barn and cleared a patch of land behind her house for runs and kennels. Volunteers trickled in, teenagers earning community service hours, retirees with time and patience, women who'd escaped violent homes and found healing in the rhythm of caring for frightened animals. A local carpenter offered to build a new fence. Lena sent boxes of supplies from the clinic, blankets, food, medicine. Soon, Nora's property echoed with new life, the nervous bark of a shepherd mix learning to trust, the playful growl of 2 rescued pups, the soft laughter of people sharing stories by the fire. Rook moved through it all with a quiet authority, greeting each arrival with a patient gaze and gentle nose. Dogs that wouldn't let anyone near them would, over time, curl up beside Rook as if he were the oldest friend they'd never known. One afternoon, Nora stood at the edge of her new sanctuary. The words still felt strange on her tongue, watching the sun filter through the pines. Rook lay in the grass with Leo, the boy's head resting on the dog's broad shoulder. Abby was inside, coaxing her mutt to eat, while another volunteer gently brushed out the fur of a half-blind collie. The place was still rough around the edges, muddy with piles of lumber and the lingering scent of paint, but Nora could feel a shift. The fear that had haunted her cabin was replaced by purpose, even joy. She kept up with the authorities, sending regular updates and photos, documenting every new arrival and every small victory. The local news crew returned to film a short segment, careful to respect Nora's privacy, but eager to capture the transformation. Donations started trickling in, bags of food, leashes, beds, even a stack of old mattresses for the people who sometimes needed to stay a night or two themselves. There were still moments of fear. Sometimes Nora would catch the glint of a strange car on the far side of the property or find an unfamiliar footprint in the mud, but the community's support made her feel less alone. Deputies drove by more often, giving her a nod of reassurance. One evening, as the light faded and the air filled with the chirr of crickets, Nora found herself surrounded by her new family, human and animal alike. Someone had started a fire in the old stone pit. Abby strummed a guitar, while Leo, silent but smiling, passed out marshmallows. Rook lay close, eyes half closed, as if listening to a language only he understood. Nora watched the flickering flames and felt the sting of tears she didn't bother to hide. It wasn't just the animals that had found sanctuary. It was her, too. The tracker who'd once run from her own shadows, now rooted in hope. She raised her voice so all could hear. No one here is broken. We're just learning how to heal. Rook lifted his head and let out a soft, steady bark. For the first time, Nora laughed without reservation, her voice carrying into the night. The sanctuary was born, not out of pity, but out of stubborn, shared survival. And as the stars blinked awake over the mountains, Nora promised herself and every soul under her roof, here, they would never be alone again. As summer rolled into the valley, the sanctuary found its rhythm. Mornings began with the chorus of barks and the scent of fresh hay. Evenings wound down with soft conversations and the crackle of the fire pit. Rook moved among the growing group with quiet assurance, his once hesitant steps now confident and strong, the limp barely noticeable, except on the chilliest days. Rook's transformation was more than physical. With every week that passed, he seemed to step further out of his own shadow. It started with little things. He began to greet newcomers at the gate, nose twitching with gentle curiosity. Dogs that wouldn't tolerate a human touch let Rook settle beside them, drawing comfort from his steady presence. Some of the residents started calling him the gentle sheriff, always on patrol, always watching. But it was with Leo that Rook's healing gifts shone brightest. Leo, the silent boy with fire-scarred arms, had been at the sanctuary for nearly a month. In that time, he'd barely spoken a word, his voice lost somewhere in the trauma that had brought him here. He spent his days in the garden or wandering the edge of the woods, always with the black cat trailing behind. One morning, Nora found Leo curled up on the porch, tears streaking his cheeks. Rook was lying beside him, head in Leo's lap, eyes closed. As Nora watched from the doorway, she saw Leo's lips move. Silent words, whispered secrets, or maybe just sounds, but Rook listened as if each syllable mattered. That night, Leo's grandmother found Nora in the kitchen, her eyes shining with gratitude. He hasn't let anyone close since the fire, she whispered. But your dog, he sits with him through the night terrors. He's the only one who can wake Leo without him screaming. Nora smiled, a lump rising in her throat. Rook knows what it's like to be afraid, she replied. He's teaching all of us how to come back. The stories multiplied. Abby, once shy and jittery, began to join the others in chores and even found herself leading a dog walking group through the woods. A teenage boy who'd lost his family in a car accident confided in Nora, saying he felt seen for the first time when Rook sat beside him during a panic attack. The animals, too, an old, half-blind collie, a kitten rescued from the highway, gravitated to Rook's steady warmth. That one afternoon, a small group of volunteers gathered to paint a mural on the barn's wall. They chose a scene of rolling hills, wildflowers, and, in the center, a larger-than-life Rook standing watch. As they worked, people began to stop by just to watch or leave a note of thanks. Nora overheard a little girl tug her mother's sleeve and whisper, "That's the dog who makes people better, right?" Rook's fame spread further than Nora expected. A local therapist reached out asking if she could bring a group of children dealing with trauma for a visit. Even people who'd never met Rook sent letters and donations describing their own struggles and the hope they felt hearing his story. It wasn't all easy. The sanctuary saw its share of setbacks: sick animals, frayed tempers, nights when Nora sat awake, wrestling with her own doubts. Sometimes the old fear crept in, especially when she found a threatening note left in her mailbox, or heard a rumor that Everett Roar's associates were still out there, angry about what she'd exposed. But each time, Rook seemed to sense her anxiety. He'd rest his head on her knee, or simply lean into her until the fear ebbed, replaced by a steadiness she couldn't quite explain. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the windows and sending many of the sanctuary's dogs into a frenzy of barking. Leo was one of the first to wake, sweat beading his brow as the thunder cracked. Before Nora could reach him, Rook slipped into the room and climbed onto Leo's bed. Leo's breathing slowed. His trembling stopped. By the time Nora peeked inside, the boys and the dog were both asleep, side by side. As summer deepened, Rook became more than just a survivor. He became a symbol. For the people and animals who came to the sanctuary, he was proof that healing was possible, even after the worst betrayals. Volunteers started making Rook's Rules posters, listing lessons they'd learned. Be patient, listen more than you speak. Never leave someone alone in the dark. In the evenings, when the chores were done and the air smelled of pine and smoke, the community gathered on the porch. Nora would sometimes read aloud from the old notebook, the one she'd filled with Rook's progress, notes on each animal, and the stories people shared. One evening, as the sun set behind the peaks, Leo finally spoke. It was just one word, quiet but clear. Rook. The group fell silent, and Nora blinked back tears. Rook lifted his head, eyes shining, and licked Leo's hand. The healing was far from finished. There would be hard days and old ghosts yet. But as laughter drifted up into the night and Rook curled beside Leo, Nora knew. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply stay and let love do the rest. The first touch of autumn crept through the valley, gold and crimson leaves flickering down to rest beside the old porch. The air was brisk, scented with wood smoke and the promise of new beginnings. Nora stood at the fence line, watching Rook as he raced a pair of rescued pups across the field. His limp was barely noticeable now, a badge of survival rather than a mark of defeat. The sanctuary had changed in ways Nora never imagined. It had started as a refuge for a single wounded dog and a woman trying to outrun her own memories, but now it thrived, alive with the chaos and joy of second chances. Children chased chickens through tall grass. Volunteers stacked firewood and rebuilt sheds. Formerly fearful animals lounged in the sunlight, their trust growing day by day. Rook was at the heart of it all. He was older now, gray speckling his muzzle, but his spirit was unbroken. He had become both guardian and healer, a gentle leader whose presence reassured every creature who crossed the sanctuary's threshold. Even the most broken souls seemed to find their footing beside him. As evening fell, Nora called everyone in for dinner. The long farmhouse table groaned beneath platters of bread, roasted vegetables, and steaming stews. There was laughter, deep, full-bellied laughter that Nora hadn't heard in years, not since before her own loss. She caught Leo grinning shyly across the table, a smear of gravy on his cheek, while Abby helped a newcomer pour water for the animals gathered at their feet. After the meal, Nora found herself drawn to the porch, seeking the quiet hush of twilight. She carried 2 mugs of tea, one for herself, one for Lena, who had stopped by after another long shift at the clinic. Lena sank into the rocking chair beside her, rubbing tired hands over her eyes. You built something special here, Nora," Lena murmured, her gaze sweeping over the bustling barnyard. "You and that dog of yours." Nora smiled, watching Rook roll in the grass with the pups, their joyful yelps carrying on the breeze. "I didn't do it alone. None of us did." None of us. For a long time, neither spoke. The sky blazed with the orange and violet of a Montana sunset, a reminder that beauty could rise from ruin. Rook padded up the porch steps, settling beside Nora and pressing his head against her knee. She scratched behind his ears, feeling the rumble of contentment deep in his chest. People drifted outside, drawn by the spectacle of dusk. Leo leaned against the railing, his black cat perched on his shoulder. Abby joined them with her little dog, now plump and happy. Even the animals seemed to sense the peace. No one barked, no one growled, not even the newest arrivals. For a moment the world was utterly still. Nora looked around at the faces illuminated by the golden light. She thought of the scars, on bodies and hearts alike, that each of them carried. She remembered the first night Rook slept beside her door, how neither of them had dared to hope for more. Now, they were surrounded by survivors, human and animal, each learning day by day that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain, but about growing strong in spite of it. She knelt beside Rook, her hand resting on his broad shoulders. "You showed us all how to stay," she whispered. "How to keep going no matter what." As if understanding, Rook nudged her chin with his nose, tail thumping softly. Leo reached out, shy but brave, and rested his hand on Rook's back. The others gathered close, forming a circle of warmth and light against the encroaching night. Nora raised her voice, steady and clear. "We all came here hurting. We all lost something. Sometimes it felt like everything. But look at us now. Every scar tells a story, and every story is worth hearing. You don't need a voice to save someone. You just need to stay." The group fell silent, the message sinking in. For some, there were tears. For others, a quiet smile. Abby slipped her arm around Nora's shoulders, and Lena squeezed her hand. Even the animals seemed to sense the weight of the moment, curling closer together. As the last rays of sun disappeared, Nora watched Rook settle at her feet, surrounded by the family they had built from the ashes. She knew the world would keep turning, that darkness would come and go. But here, in this place, they had carved out a haven, one that would outlast the pain, a testament to the power of staying. She turned to the gathered faces, some familiar, some new, all changed, and spoke softly, her words carried by hope. "If you believe in what we've built here, if you believe in second chances, share our story. Follow, tell others what you've seen. There are so many still waiting for a place to heal. Together, we can make sure they find it." The stars winked on, one by one, over the sanctuary. Rook looked up, eyes bright, as if to say, "We made it. We're home." And for the first time in years, Nora felt whole.